You're watching Toronto Sports Rush on the Bet Rivers Network.
Hey everyone, welcome on into Toronto Sports Rush. And just because the NHL isn't playing right now and the Toronto Maple Leafs aren't playing any NHL games does not mean we stop talking Leafs. And that's why we are so thrilled to be able to welcome in someone who knows the Leafs so well. And that is David Alter, who is Toronto Maple Leafs reporter for the Hockey News, who is actually there at the rink. And I know this because every time I'm looking for the lines, I go to your Twitter, your X feed, and I always know I can rely on you for the latest on the Toronto Maple Leafs. And we talk a lot here on the show about the Leafs, but we do not have the perspective of you of being there. So, David, thanks so much for joining us.
I appreciate the kind words, Julie. It's a pleasure being on, for sure.
Well, I mean, you are right there in the thick of it. And, we've been talking a ton about the Leafs this year, as evidenced by the name of this podcast. And so just from your vantage point, let's take a step back. And we're halfway through the season. We're currently in this sort of international Four Nations break. When you look back on, let's start with the coaches, like Craig Berube coming in versus obviously the past of Sheldon Keefe, but we'll stick with Craig. In what way would you you look back and you take a step back and you look at his effect on the team? How would you describe it so far?
I think he's done a pretty good job of keeping the guys a bit loose. I think there's been times in the past where when it gets to pressure-packed situations, it could feel a little tense around the room. And that's not necessarily a knock on Sheldon Keefe. I think that's just the guys growing up and maturing a little bit. But certainly when you bring in someone like Berube, just even the day-to-day conversations you have with him, you just get a sense that whether it's a good game, bad game, he doesn't wear it. He just just rolls with it and uses that to push the message across. And he's no BS. He'll tell you what he's thinking and he'll explain why. And he'll do it in a way where you can joke about it, disarm in a way. It's I haven't really seen it before, but granted, I haven't had a lot of day-to-day experience covering many coaches, so I'm only comparing in recent past. But yeah, there's certainly a likability about the guy, and you can see in the way he talks to us how it it goes with the players, that he'll tell you, he'll joke about it, He'll be serious about it when he needs to be. But the big difference I'm seeing is after a loss, he's not emotional afterwards. He pretty much knows how to just compartmentalize that game, take what he didn't like about it, communicate it to you, and just move on and go to the next one.
Well, that's a huge plus for people in the media when you have to talk to a Toronto Maple Leafs coach after a loss, or any coach after a loss. As I've mentioned, I have many memories of covering Randy Carlyle and it not being my favorite memories. Randy Carlyle for the Ducks, by the way, not the Leafs, which would be
I did Leafs too back in the day.
Okay.
That was my very early days, so I do know what you're
you were thrown right into it.
No, it was different though. The funny thing about Randy, and he even mentioned it too, he underwent some sort of training a little bit coming in from Anaheim to Toronto, just understanding it was going to be different. So he had to be a little bit different, if you know what I mean, in terms of a lot of that stuff. So it was very different. I've noticed. And then when he went back to Anaheim, I think he took some of that with him too.
That's when I got it. I got him from Toronto to Anaheim. So it was he brought the Toronto energy of having to deal with you guys all the time to Anaheim, where, it's really just not a whole lot going on right here, just because there's so many teams and, hockey in Southern California, not necessarily always the biggest thing. Okay, so when you look at Craig Berube, you talked about how, who he is and dealing with him with media. In what way do you see his influence just on the players and on the team?
Yeah, I think he's done a pretty good job of just kind of getting people to buy in defensively and kind of be more of a focus of it and getting guys to kind of stand up for each other. It's a lot of things that the team kind of knew before they had to do, but you're kind of seeing it go into effect. And so an early example of that was, I think it was like 5 or 6 games into the season, they play Tampa and they have one of the more physical, aggressive games of the season. It was one of those ones where you probably heard about how in previous years, the Leafs were shown clips of how Tampa sticks up for one another, and they need to do that a little bit more. And so when Tampa came into town, I think they kind of showed or made a point to show, hey, we're different. We hit different. We feel different. And it's going to be a little bit different. The other thing, too, is just maybe not so much getting focused on personal stats. You know, guys like Auston Matthews have struggled to produce as much. William Nylander is producing. Mitch Marner is getting a lot of assists and points, but it's certainly not the torrid pace that maybe collectively the Leafs had been known for. You saw that, especially in the first half of the season. They went from one of the top scoring teams to one of the mid scoring teams, but the defense, the goals against has improved, and they're right up there. And that was a big ask of Berube for the team to be like, listen, we've got to be a lot different. Got to play better defensively. There's going to be situations where, like the very first game Craig Berube head coached was against Montreal, and it was the first time in years that they had been shut out, which was a real telling point that, okay, maybe the offense is going to be a little different, and there might be some 1-0 games, but you're going to have to kind of get used to that, because in the playoffs, that's how you're going to win games. It's going to be the low-scoring defense first kind of mentality. So I think you've seen that in the players, that he's really kind of pushed that message across, and the players, at least for now, look like they've bought into that. Of course, it's the regular season and everyone's kind of biding their time and waiting to see how this transposes into the playoffs.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, in the past, we've really looked at the stats of the big stars, and if Auston Matthews went out, it was kind of the end of the world. But the idea of sort of even looking at Florida Panthers last year and what Paul Maurice had said, kind of that team defense, right? Like everyone's locked and loaded. And I talked with Mike Sullivan the other day about Team USA and the importance of being connected and chemistry versus like raw talent is great, but it means nothing unless like you are all on the same page. You're all fighting for one another. And so we've seen so many guys go in and out of the lineup this year with injuries. It feels as though they haven't even had like a full healthy lineup at all at some point this season. When you look at Auston Matthews, like what is like, how important is he for this team this year? In the like, he's obviously an important player, but like in the way that they are playing and the way they want to play, what level maybe of concern would you have if he was to go out, or if he wasn't clicking and firing on all cylinders? As we know, he's kind of had a bit of a goal drought. Like, sort of, what's your take on him this year?
Well, I think the biggest thing for him, regardless of the production, is just kind of leading by example. You know, he puts the C on, and even though he says not a lot is going to change, how he conducts himself, how he leads, how he pushes everyone forward is really going to be the measure of Auston Matthews' season. Because even if he's not going to match the goal total he had last year. That's apparent. There's been times where his play has kind of struggled due to injury. He looks like he's back in it. We'll see how this tournament plays out and how that affects him. But he's going to have to really have these types of performances where he can take his team on his back, whether it's through offense or saying the right things or just leading, because it's a big decision to take the captaincy away from someone who's already on the team and still sticking around. That how you go about that and how you perform and how you stick up for one another and just your day-to-day is going to be the measure of the Toronto Maple Leafs in the playoffs. Maybe in those moments when they were down by a goal or 2 goals, he may have not felt the need to say something in the room because he isn't wearing that C, where now everyone's going to be looking to him. Now what do we do? And that's where the real adversity kicks in. And so I think that's going to be the measure of Auston Matthews' season. If the Leafs have a deep run and he's a reason for it, or not a reason for it, or maybe he is, we just don't see it in points, everything's going to be measured based on that. because that's the biggest change they made outside of changing the core four and the head coach that a lot of people have been kind of asking for after years of a lack of playoff success. So really that's what it's going to come down to.
Right. It'll be interesting. I mean, we don't get a chance to see what it's like, the locker room dynamics, but having Auston Matthews be a guy that fires up, or, if he does kind of fire up the guys in the playoffs versus a John Tavares who seems a little bit more subdued just based on his personality. And I don't know anything about how fired up Auston Matthews gets guys, but he has that vibe about him. When you look at big news, by the way, we're recording this on Thursday after the Canada-Sweden game, but Mitch Marner wins it in overtime for Canada. And first of all, you love to see this for Mitch because he works his tail off and also is an amazing player. He's gotten a lot of flack from people for, I don't know, even really know why, but the guy is having an incredible season, also in contract year. What do you think maybe, what's the trajectory of how you think things go for him with his Leafs future?
Yeah, it's such a tough one to read. If you would have asked me in the summer, I would have thought maybe a change might be happening. Now it kind of seems more and more like nothing is going to get resolved until the playoffs hit. I've seen some suggestion that it would be really expensive and not a good idea to let this kind of be a distraction in the playoffs. I don't see it being a distraction in the playoffs that way. And I think that personally, I think that'd be the worst time to figure that out. You want to kind of get a sense of either getting cost control by doing it way early or doing it way late when you have all the data points. And certainly the big data point is the playoffs. Now, what happened in that Canada game against Sweden is certainly great for someone like Mitch Marner, because there's always been the criticism of, can he do it in the clutch and score in the clutch? And there's no bigger goal scored maybe right now than that. So in these pressure-packed situations, maybe he can kind of wear that. We're used to seeing and all the talk of Mitch Marner wearing too much of the pressure in Toronto and that getting him in the playoffs. So you kind of hope another year and that experience he can kind of put that in his hip pocket for when the pressure does kind of build up from a personal level going into the playoffs. And then at that point, if he can help the Leafs get to where he wants to get to, then I'm sure the Leafs would have no problem breaking the bank for him. But it's going to be up to him, too. He's undergone a lot of scrutiny here in Toronto. At some point, he's going to want to be a family man, from what I understand. And it's going to be a matter of where he wants to spend the next few years of his life. He's only known Toronto. And there's a lot that can kind of go into those kind of decisions of playing here or playing somewhere else. But the cap is going up a ton. There's a lot of free agents that are going to be asking for a lot of money. There's Mikko Rantanen that's also out there as well. A lot can happen. Like, there's just so much that can happen. And just talking to agents, everyone's biding their time and salivating because they now know how much the cap is going up roughly for the next 3 years. And that's unprecedented. So that's making negotiations all the more complex as well.
Right, and seeing like the trades that have gone down so far, especially you mentioned Rantanen and Natchez, and just that whole thing, I think really it shook the entire league up in terms of how the magnitude of trades that can happen, and that's not even as you're considering the salary cap going up in the future. Now, looking at the Leafs with Anthony Stolarz coming back, Joseph Woll there, Hildeby, but like Woll and Stolarz, what do you make of these two goalies? Like, who do you think, who's the 1A and who's the 1B?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer because it all depends on who's available at that point. Both guys have had injuries that have kept them out for stretches this season, yet both have performed really well. And so I think the Leafs, for the most part, injuries aside, have been very happy with how both goalies have performed. And I mean, if I had to kind of go into it now, I would only say Woll because Woll's played more recent and has the reps under him. And judging by Leafs goaltending tandems over the last few years, it's almost kind of pointless to kind of make that decision because they don't really have to decide until the very end. And I remember last season looking at it, everyone thought it was going to be Wall, and who started the playoffs? It was Samsonov, because he had been playing the best and was most available up until that point. Joseph Wall went through a major injury from December to February, I believe it was, last year. And Samsonov was able to get out of those struggles where it looked like he may not even play in the NHL again. So it's a tough one to answer now. So going from a recent, if the playoffs were to start tomorrow, then I think your 1A would be Wall because he's played recently. But you look at the game Stolarz came back in, and he was dynamite against Seattle. He showed all the flashes of brilliance that has him at the top save percentage in the NHL. So it's really good. If both guys are healthy, it's going to be who's playing better going down the stretch. That's all it's going to be. Because the one thing we know for sure is by game one of the playoffs, you have to have a starter established. There is no 1A and 1B at that point. So it's really going to be health and availability. I think Joseph Wall understands that. In all my conversations with him, he seems like someone who's trying to do his best to build up the threshold of being able to play through knocks and bumps and bruises so that doesn't come under scrutiny for him anymore. So I think, there's that pressure with both goalies that can they endure, because they have not been battle tested at the NHL level for this many games, and both have already gone through injuries. So when they're available, Toronto's goaltending has never looked better, but they both have to be available, or at least one of them have to be available when it matters, and we still have a couple months.
Right, and that theme of being available seems to be permeating like this entire season of like, they're really good when these guys are in the lineup, but then half the time these guys are out of the lineup or someone gets injured or whatever. And that's just, I mean, as we were kind of thinking, it's like, well, I was talking with someone in the league, and I said, well, what if someone gets injured during Four Nations? We did see Shea Theodore go out, unfortunately, last night, which is, that's the worst nightmare as Vegas Golden Knights or any team. But the person I was talking with said we can't really sort of plan our trade plans around Four Nations because guys could get injured doing anything. Like, as I joked with Sarah Sivian, just, back to the Dustin Penner days of gets injured eating pancakes. Like, guys can something can happen. JT getting injured in warm-ups or whatever, practice them. But when you look at maybe, we know that you're still working. We know that trades can still happen during the Four Nations, which is really fascinating. And I hope one happens that makes it kind of, cool, kind of ups the ante a bit in terms of maybe shaking things up. But as you're kind of working with the Leafs and this whole time, what's your vibe on what kind of moves they're looking to make right now?
Yeah, I mean, look, the phones are still operating because every day is still a day in the NHL season, the way the cap works and everything. So, you're even seeing the waiver wire is still pretty active as teams try to build up cap space by sending guys up and down leading up to the trade deadline. From a Leaf perspective, I just keep hearing the same thing that's mostly out there, which is looking for a 2-3C, like a mid-6 center. Ideally, someone who can play on the second line, but it's going to be expensive. Is probably a third C is probably the best bet there, and another depth defenseman if there's room for it. The real question with the Maple Leafs is they don't really have a lot of prospects. They have some, and then they don't have their first round pick this year. So do they want to risk getting rid of their 2026 first rounder and then going through not having a first rounder yet again? They had it with Danford. Actually, I think they moved up to get it because they lost their first round pick. So they ended up getting back to 30 to select Danford. But it's a very late first round pick. So they still want to make those kind of moves, still kind of figure that out. At some point or another, it's becoming clear in the Leafs situation that making those moves closer to the deadline is easier than earlier, because at that point they're able to expand their roster a little bit, because after the trade deadline they can no longer have the 23-man roster limit, and they're fully healthy right now for the most part, with the exception of like Yarncroke and Hakanpää. So you look at some of that. It's a tricky one to balance. It is, but those are the two spots. Those are the obvious needs. Those are the ones that they're trying to fix and kind of get figured out. But I mean, that asking price is going to be easier, and it's going to be easier to fit under the cap as they kind of get closer to that March deadline for sure.
So would you think, like, realistically, would they part ways with some of their prospects?
I think they would for the right one. If there's someone with term, like that's one of those things they kind of have to look at in that particular situation as well. So I think we would get there. It's just really a matter of who's it going to be. Like, you know, Scott Lawton's name's out there. I can't remember off the bat if he's got term. If he's got term,
I think he does have term.
Can kind of get some. Okay, so then maybe like that might make sense. I get the sense from the Leafs that they don't want to part with a blue chip prospect or a top pick if they don't get some sort of term with it, because they kind of have to extend the timeline there. So there is that element of it. And then at that point, do they feel they have enough? So I think it can kind of get there. It's going to be really tricky. Now that they're fully healthy, it's easier for them to manage with what they kind of have to work with. But it's always easier making these deals closer to the deadline, because if there is a long-term injury between now and then, it opens up the door for so much more that they can do for less.
Is there a world where they don't make any trades and they are okay?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do feel that they probably should improve their roster. I think they'll look around and kind of do it. I think if I remember correctly, you know, last year they didn't do much. I think they just got like Connor Dewar and Joel Edmondson, and they kind of left things alone. They didn't really have a lot of space. They were way thinner on space last year than they were now. So they had to do a lot of double retention and kind of creative things to kind of fit some of these other guys in there. Actually, Joel Edmondson, if I remember correctly, he was already retained once in that deal, so it was already 50% of that. But there is a situation where I think they can do it. I don't think anyone looked at their run last year and felt they didn't do enough, and if they would have got so-and-so, maybe that would have propelled them. Last year, everyone looked at Auston Matthews was injured for a couple of games or ill or whatever it was. William Nylander was unavailable due to eye migraines, and they just didn't have enough offense. So I think they would be fine. They just, when it comes down to it, their top guys have to perform and they have to play better defensively. And if they get both of those, then they'll be fine. But they just, for whatever reason or another, the bounces have just not gone their way when it comes to playoff time.
Right. Well, as you mentioned, they have upgraded already in terms of defense, goaltending, things that as people in Toronto have been clamoring for years. And when you have that, and also with your top guys firing and seeing sort of this resurgence of John Tavares has been really great. I think everyone just kind of rooting for the guy who's also been, I live in New York. I was at the Islanders game, as I'm sure you were, where people were yelling like no one's captain or something. I was like, damn, that is friggin'
They'll
deep.
Never let that go. It's I don't know how long that's been now. When it was 2018. Yeah, I've seen grudges, but that one, wow, I can't believe it's still going.
I kind of respect that spiteless because it's so insane that it's still there. It's like just so beyond Larry David level that it's like, okay, if you like their identity. And I'll say this, Islanders fans' identity is hating other teams. That's like,
well, it's also not being the biggest team in the biggest market. I think that comes down to it. I see a lot of Ottawa when I look at.
That's exactly it. I was just going to say,
I see a lot of. Yeah, I see a lot of that. Like in terms of, there's the bigger brother team down the whatever nearby that gets most of the attention in the spotlight. So. I think that there might be some of that to it. Like, I think if Tavares was a Ranger for this long, there probably wouldn't be as much vitriol if he came over and did whatever. I don't know. I could be completely wrong on that. I love New York, but I don't pretend to know the market as well. But yeah, it's crazy. I remember being in the building when he got that overtime winner to get his 1,000th point.
Yeah.
And it was funny. Like, he was getting boos the whole time. I think they put up a graphic and there was like a brief cheer and then it was right back to booing. And I just never seen a dichotomy being like, what is this?
Yeah.
I think you're giving him the respect when it's due for a minute. And then at that point, I'm like, okay, sure. I'm curious to see when his career is over, if they'll bury the hatchet then. Because I think someone like that does deserve some sort of they won't, like, his number's already retired with Butch Goring or whatever, but I feel like they've got to do something for him afterwards because
I don't know
get
if
it
they
while you're
would.
still playing.
I think they would be like, ooh, like he's so, like they
I know.
want
I
to
thought
because
Vince Carter would never have his. I thought Vince Carter would never have his number retired in Toronto, and then at some point or another, I think time heals all wounds.
But
So
people
it
were
may
booing
take a
Vince
while.
Carter coming back, when he played back.
Oh yeah.
They were?
They did, but eventually, I was at the first game as a fan.
It's not very Canadian. It feels odd.
Oh
But
no,
I guess it's
like,
actually very appropriate these days. Yeah. So
I remember the alternate "Let's Go Raptors" VC sucks chants, like when he was when he was in the building. Oh yeah, no, they carried that for a while, but that's why I think after his playing days or whatever, maybe he'll calm down a little. I get it.
We'll see.
It might still be fresh because he still plays.
Long Island is its own country. That's all I have to say about that. We're on a Toronto podcast. I'm gonna keep it 100. Okay, so right now, if you were to look at this team so far, what we've seen this season, who would you deem like the MVP?
Great question. I would say Chris Tanev, just because the defense has been that different in leading the block shots, leading in a lot of other things, and really being the go-to defenseman right now, which I didn't necessarily think was kind of going to be the case. I think you have to put Chris Tanev into that. William Nylander's played great. He certainly deserves consideration. And Mitch Marner too. But I think this year's been all about how different the team is defensively. The goaltending has certainly pulled its weight too, but I don't think any of those numbers look as good without an improved defense. And I think that's where Chris Tanev has really shined and made the biggest difference on this team so far.
That's a great answer, and especially him with Jake McCabe. That's been a great deep pairing that was very much needed. And so I guess we'll kind of end on this. We know that the Four Nations are going on. We talked about it. We talked about Mitch. Whenever I say Mitch, I always think of Old School, where Will Ferrell's he's like, come on, Mitch, and he's hitting Luke Wilson. Or is he hitting? No. I forget which. I can't
remember the scene. I've seen the movie, but it's been so
whoever's carrying the baby. It's either he's hitting. Is it him saying? Yeah, him saying it. The Vince Vaughn. He's like, "Come on, Mitch." Whatever at the goalie stick. I love that this is called my brain is just called drunk history. Basically, sometimes on the show, it's like, oh, my analogy I'm trying to explain and I forgot what it was. Okay, but when you're looking at say we got Canada USA coming up on Saturday night. I am allegedly going to be there. I have booked a trip to Montreal. I do not have a ticket yet, and I really wish I probably had bought that before last night, but just looking at the prices of what everything is now. But I will find a way into that game. What do you expect from Four Nations going forward, just in terms of the entire tournament and who you think is going to win?
Yeah, I think the United States is still a force to be reckoned with there. I just think that they have the all-around defensive parts, the goaltending, and the forwards. It's really just going to come down to chemistry, which we're going to find out to see if they have. Canada really impressed me with how well they performed on that power play goal in terms of the chemistry that was already established and built and how much they worked to kind of get that in there. So I expect I expect a big performance from the United States. What we see, I don't know. And I'm curious to see how Auston Matthews performs in this, just because his offense and just kind of taking a team on his back has been a little bit different and challenging this year with a couple of the injuries he's dealt with. When you look at Sweden, William Nylander was okay. I thought he was going to be a bit better. Finland, that's going to be really tough. I think that reminds me of those teams that you're going to have to rely on the goaltending to steal you games, just because the defense is so thin on there. So I put Finland 4. I think Sweden's going to be 3, just based on what we've seen so far. And I think it's going to be a Canada-U.S. final, which I know tournament organizers are certainly hoping for.
Yeah, just sort of like,
and it's really going to come down
pushing it along in that way. Sorry, and it's going to come down to what I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. I think it's just going to come down to if the Americans have the chemistry. If they have the chemistry, it's their tournament, I believe. Canada's already at a disadvantage because we have a 3-point system, and they only got 2 points in that first game. And so if the United States establishes a dominant game against Finland, they can kind of carry that momentum and then kind of build it into the final. And the final is going to be in the United States. And based on what we saw in Montreal, I think that's going to be a factor in this tournament for sure.
Right. And with Sweden coming back too against Canada in the game, I mean, you'd think that maybe undergoing something like that would hopefully, I don't know, kind of help you see some of the holes in different areas. And as we mentioned, Shea Theodore being out, so that's one demon that they don't have. I would say, though, when we talked about Mitch before and him being able to look back on that moment, as I liken it to just this Harry Potter. Sorry, I feel like as soon as I'm about to say something, I'm like, hey, do you want to say this? Harry Potter quote where he's like, I knew I could do it because I'd done it before. So I feel as though Mitch can be look to that moment hey, I did that thing. I've already done it. But the asterisk is Sidney Crosby. My God. Sidney Crosby should be a Toronto Maple Leaf. We get Sid. I mean, I never would have said that, but I reposted it, but I don't know what his name is, but it's Wozy from Edmonton. Reposted just Homer Simpson as a child watching Sidney Crosby score the golden goal, and then Homer Simpson as an adult.
Yeah.
It's been 15 years since Sidney Crosby scored the golden goal in the 2010 Olympics. And it's my Lord, how is this guy still doing this? I mean, it just shows how well he's taking care of his body and also just how good of a competitor he is. But I think, it's great to see Cros playing at this level, especially because we weren't really sure what we were going to get after he'd been injured. But just thinking about Mitch, I'm darn, it'd be really nice to have Crosby there feeding those apples to him.
Yeah, well, I mean, he's incredibly clutch. And the funny thing with Crosby, too, in that tournament in 2010, I remember leading up to that game, everyone was kind of he's kind of having an underwhelming Olympics. No one was really talking about him or anything. And then he comes up with the biggest goal in Canadian best-on-best history as far as most people are concerned. So, and then I think his record's now 25-0 representing Canada, which is just
wow.
That.
That's why you brought him to the team. That's
yes. Well, and look, he had every reason where he could have been I got to preserve my body, do whatever. And he made it a point to make sure he was available for himself and for everybody else, which is what you expect from great players, but from leaders. And you expect all of that to spill over. So, I mean, there is that Sidney Crosby factor that can allow Canada to perhaps run the table. I'm still a bit skeptical just because I think the Americans look so dominant when you look at it on paper. I just don't see any holes. So
I know. And you mentioned goaltending. We mentioned goaltending defense. I mean, Connor Hellebuck right there. It's going to be your guy to have to solve. And that's, I don't know how you do it. But we'll have to figure out. We'll have to see. USA definitely got a lot of They definitely feel like the Iceland of this Mighty Duck situation with the Kachuk brothers, and kind of that they're the heel. The tournament's in Canada right now, so of course they're the visitors in that respect. But like when it does shift to the USA, it'll be the other way around, I'm sure. But enough about that. We are very thankful, David, for you coming on here to talk about the Leafs when the Leafs aren't playing right now, but I know they are going to be soon, and we look forward to the second half it's in the second half. We look forward to the next, whatever half of this season is, heading down to trade deadline and to the playoffs, and we appreciate you joining us here on Toronto Sports Rush.
You got it. Thanks for having me on, Julie.
Thanks for watching Toronto Sports Rush on the Bet Rivers Network.